We're going to bring the demand side and the supply side together and talk about equilibrium in the demand and supply model. Equilibrium in the demand and supply model means we're talking about the solution to the question of how much of a product will be produced and what will be the equilibrium price. We'll also use oil as an example of how to use and think about demand and supply. And we'll talk about some other takeaways from the demand and supply model. Here's the definition of equilibrium. It's the price at which the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. That's what we're going to define as equilibrium in this model. So equilibrium and the demand and supply model. That means we are going to assume that there is some equilibrium value for the price of oil per barrel, if we're using the oil market as an example, and an equilibrium quantity demanded and quantity supplied. Now you see in the diagram here, I just drew two straight lines. The downward sloping line is the demand curve, the upward sloping curve is the supply curve, and the intersection of those two curves determines the equilibrium price of oil and the equilibrium quantity of oil. Equilibrium quantity of oil means both the quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal to each other. Now, the case we need to make is, why do we expect that the market will end up at that point? What force is going to cause the market to move to that $30, 65 million barrels of oil point? So here is the proposition or the claim that we are going to make. Our claim is that equilibrium will occur at the intersection of the demand and supply curves. We also claim that equilibrium price and quantity are the only ones that are stable in a free market. And we also claim that should we be at a different point, economic forces will push prices and quantities back toward equilibrium. Before I explain why we think that we will reach equilibrium, I should explain that we are going to temporarily use the word surplus in a particular way to explain equilibrium. And to clarify, the word surplus has actually two meanings in this model. So don't get confused. The first meaning is a situation in which quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. The second, which we've talked about before, is the idea of the net gain to a seller or buyer from participating in the market, as in consumer surplus or producer surplus. And normally it will be clear which meaning we are using. So for the next one or two slides, I'm going to use surplus in the sense of simply the quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. I'm only going to be using it in the sense of number one. So the claim is that we are going to end up at this intersection point. Why do we think we will get to equilibrium? Why don't we just stay where we are? Well, the explanation is we imagine that there are forces that will push the market toward equilibrium. Excess demand and excess supply. So let's start with the situation where we are out of equilibrium. Specifically, that we are at a position where the quantity supplied is 900 and the quantity demanded is only 500. And the reason we're at that starting position is because for some reason the market price of oil happens to be $75. At $75, as you can see, producers are happy to supply a lot of oil. They will supply 900 million barrels. But buyers are not that thrilled about it, and at a price per barrel of $75, the quantity demanded, I should say, is only 500 million barrels of oil. So we have a gap, we have a surplus. We have 900 million barrels being supplied, but only 500 million barrels being demanded. And that gap is going to give rise to a force that will tend to push the market price down. So some producers are going to lower their asking price, and as they lower their asking price, the quantity demanded will increase. And so what you see is that the gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded will decrease. No supplier, no producer wants to get stuck with oil that they cannot sell. So there's sort of a competition between them to lower the price and sell everything they have. Here is the opposite situation. For some reason, we're going to assume that the market price of oil is lower than what would be the equilibrium price. So what this means is that you get a lot of excess demand, but you have insufficient quantity supplied. So what we expect now is that buyers are going to start raising their offer to try to obtain the oil that they want. And as more and more buyers raise their offer price, that's going to tend to drive the price of oil up. And that is why we expect that the market will reach equilibrium, even if it starts out of equilibrium because of a surplus or a shortage. Market forces will tend to drive the market price to the equilibrium value of $60 a barrel. And once you reach that equilibrium point, you'll stay there forever unless there's some kind of shock to the system, unless there's something that changes the position of the demand and supply curve. So far, we've made the case why the market reaches equilibrium, but we haven't actually made an explanation for why we think that equilibrium is a good thing. Why do we think that the free market is maximizing the potential gains from trade? There are three conditions for a free market to maximize gains from trade. One is that the available goods are bought by buyers who have the highest willingness to pay. That is, those who value the goods the most are the ones who will be able to afford to buy them. Number two, that goods are sold by the sellers with the lowest costs. From society's perspective, we understand that the most efficient thing is for the product, like oil, to be sold by those producers who can do it at the lowest cost in terms of resources used. And a third condition for markets to be not only working but efficient and socially desirable is we don't want there to be any possible gains from trade which were not exploited, not obtained. But we also don't want any trades that are wasteful to happen either. In other words, we want exactly the right number of trades to happen, not too many, not too few. And we want the product to be sold to the buyers who have the highest value for it. And we want the production to occur at the lowest possible cost by the producers who are able to produce at the most sort of efficient, cost-effective way. So these are the three conditions that will imply gains from trade are maximized through this demand and supply situation. So we know that there are no unexploited gains from trade when we're at that equilibrium point of a price of $70 a barrel and quantity produced and sold of 70 million barrels of oil. And we can see there are no unexploited gains from trade because every buyer who values a barrel of oil at $70 or above has been able to buy the oil. And every seller who can produce at less than $70 a barrel has been able to sell their oil. Now, another way to say that is that at that equilibrium of $70 and 70 million barrels of oil, total consumer surplus and total producer surplus have been maximized. And prior videos, including the very good Marginal Revolution University Exploring Equilibrium video, shows all of that maximization of producer and buyer surplus. So we can say that we've reached $70 and $70, the equilibrium point. If we tried to sell beyond the $70 price or beyond the $70 quantity produced, we would be going into the territory on the right of the intersection point, and we've done as well as we can. And there are no unexploited gains from trade. If we tried to produce oil at an amount greater than $70, we'd be getting into a territory where it actually costs more to produce a barrel of oil than there is value to consumers to buy it. So that $70 amount to produce is sort of the stopping point. You don't want to go beyond producing 70. You don't want to get into that green area there. That green area is actually a loss. It's like a negative surplus area. It's a combination of negative consumer surplus and negative producer surplus. And so if you go beyond $70 in production, you're actually going backwards. So we stop at $70 and 70 million barrels. We don't produce any more. Otherwise, we're in that green area, which is actually a waste of resources. It's exactly like having a combination of negative consumer surplus and negative producer surplus.